when you were sharing screen?
Because it makes me anxious. It pings my OCD, Matt.
I know.
All right. All right, everybody. So today we're obviously going to talk, and we alluded to this a little bit on Monday, but the autonomic nervous system, again, important to note, not the central nervous system, and respiration mechanics. So these things we pair together because they kind of help regulate one another to an extent. So we're gonna talk about that a little bit as well. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the Gen Pop programming once we get through this. So just to kind of give you a precursor for the case study that we're talking about next week. So I'm going to start with a quote from one of my favorite authors, if not my favorite author from a nonfiction standpoint, Robert Sapolsky. So this is from his book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, which is a funny name, but it's all about stress and stress reactions in the allostatic nervous system. So sometimes it can be enormously stressful to construct a world without stressors. And for me, this is the fitness industry, like summed up. Like when we talk about, not necessarily the fitness, but like when we talk about like biohacking, we talk about like a lot of these other things. We have a large portion of the population that are trying to avoid stress at all costs, right? Where stress is automatically perceived as a negative thing. When the reality of it is, one, stress is just stress. Your perception of the stress actually dictates more the positive or negative impact to your system than anything else. So there is a whole psychological and psychosomatic aspect to stress perception, and then the physiological processes that are happening once you're exposed to it. But also just the fact that if we look at just adaptation of any system within your body, the presence of stress is absolutely necessary, for the actual adaptation to occur, right? And usually repeated bouts or repeated exposures to stress are absolutely necessary for any type of adaptation. So when we think about training, we're really thinking about stress dosing, right? And it can be specific based on the adaptation that we're trying to elicit, right? So if you're training for strength, your programming and your dosing is going to look very different than if you're training for capacity or endurance or whatever, right? So again, like these are things where when we talk about programming and periodization and exercise selection and training frequency and micro, meso, and macro cycles, we're really talking about how you as a coach are applying stress to the individual in front of you to elicit the short-term and long-term adaptations that are going to be needed for them to have success within their goal, right? And you get to help determine what that actually looks like. So again, this is something that, this is a quote that's always stood out to me. Another great book, and we can put that in the Discord, is The Upside of Stress, that I think, if you're a coach, you should probably read as well, where it talks about, again, the positive impacts that stress has on the body. And that one's also fantastic. So there's a few more. They're all on my Instagram page and the highlights if you guys want to see more books, but I'll get to it, and we'll talk about the autonomic nervous system, because this is, again, how we regulate our body's physiological response to stress, right? That's the primary function, right? So the autonomic nervous system is going to be in charge of neurotransmitters, prohormones, hormones, all of those things, right? And how we kind of go through the process of using those things to regulate our systems, right? So we can either, excite our system, or we can dampen our system. And we use, different things to do those, to verge into either one of those sides. But it's all part of the same regulatory response. So when we start looking at this, one of the things we have to highlight is the stress response is often similar with both perceived and real stress, right? And that's where, your perception of a thing greatly matters in how your body organizes itself around it. So when we start looking at people who have, high levels of anxiety and things of that nature, we're typically looking at like perceived stress just as much as we are real stress, right? Where we're getting stressed over things that may not actually even happen, or based on our own biases and our own experiences, we have an elevated level of stress on something that's not actually that threatening physically towards us, right? So the argument can also be made that perceived stress is in fact real stress because of this, right? The same, cascade of neurotransmitters is going to be happening under perceived stress as it is under real stress. And that's a big part of that Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers book is zebras don't get ulcers because they don't have perceived stress. Their brains don't function in that capacity, right? They see a lion and they go, but otherwise they're pretty much parasympathetic all the time, right? So they only really have a high sympathetic stress response under threat of a predator or under things like extreme environmental conditions, like extreme hunger, heat, or weather change, things of that nature. So when they're just like out on the plain grazing, they're parasympathetic as fuck, right? They're not worried about, oh, is there a lion coming after me or behind that bush? They don't really have a threat response until they see it or hear it or smell it, right? So they're not trying to estimate or theorize what the potential environmental threat is. Whereas when we look at human beings, that's all we do, for the most part, so a lot of us have high levels of perceived stress that affect us and impact us just as much as real stress might. So I digress. The ANS regulates neurotransmitters, prohormones, and hormones, right? So again, this is something that I mentioned just a second ago, but this mechanism and these things allow for the organism, us in this case, to appropriately respond to the actual stressor, right? And this is where we start looking at types of stressors, right? So stressors can be external in the forms of environmental stimulus or internal in the form of interoceptive stimulus, right? So things like changes in core body temperature, right? Hunger, thirst, digestion, heart rate, all of those things, right? These are going to be things that are going to be interoceptive and things that are going to cause a stress response, but they're happening inside of us. They're internal mechanisms. And then the ANS, again, is primarily divided into two complementing, not competing systems, right? So this is something that, again, when you talk to a lot of coaches, especially, and they start talking about, the sympathetic system versus the parasympathetic system, they think about these things as competing and being opposites. And the fact is they are opposites, but they actually complement one another, right? So when we start looking at things like heart rate variability, HRV, that's a huge, kind of trending thing in the industry over the last few years. The variability is actually your body fluctuating from sympathetic to parasympathetic states throughout the day, right? That's where the variability comes from. A lack of heart rate variability, which would be something we would view as being negative and potentially threatening to your system, would be someone who's actually overly sympathetic and spends too much time on that realm, or overly parasympathetic and spends too much time in that realm, right? So for our bodies, the way that we typically operate and the way that we operate the most effectively is when we're fluctuating consistently from one of those states to another. And that's where, we kind of look at this in the same way we look at biomechanics, right? When we start looking at like flexion and extension, for example, you can't extend a joint unless you're coming from a flexed position, right? You can't go through the action of extension unless you're in a relatively flexed position, and vice versa. You can't flex a joint unless you're from a position of relative extension, right? So you have to be coming from somewhere to go somewhere else. And the SNS and the PNS kind of work within the same, kind of function, where you can't necessarily go through a sympathetic response unless you're coming from a relative parasympathetic state, and vice versa, right? Like you're not going to have a parasympathetic response unless you're coming from a state of sympathetic tone. And I think that's a very important concept to kind of get across, where these things aren't good or bad, they just are. And where you're probably functioning within both multiple times in an hour, right? When we even look at like the respiratory system, that's something we're going to discuss, where inhalations and exhalations actually drive different autonomic reactions at a very micro level, right? An exhalation is going to be a little more parasympathetic and an inhalation is going to be more sympathetic. right? So they're even going to drive different neurotransmitters in the cascade down to the breath and the breaths that you're taking, right? So just keep in mind that these things are always working. They're autonomic, obviously that's in the name. So you don't have to think about these things for them to function, but they will impact your daily activity, your daily lives, and your function overall and what you're doing. So breaking these down even further, we're going to get into the sympathetic nervous system first. It's the one that I think most people probably hear about the most. Most people hear about the most. That's a terrible way to phrase anything. That's why I write things on social media so I don't get trolled when I just start putting like typicallys and often and many times, and I don't want to talk about anything in absolutist terms. Wesley, man, you're the man. I appreciate you, bud. The SNS is often referred to as flight or flight, and this is probably that's probably a term that you've heard. You guys have all heard, but you've got your fight or flight response, right? And that acts as a stimulatory or excitatory system, right? And this response coordinates the body to respond to bouts of high or novel stress, right? And I always put the novel in there because anything novel is going to be inherently threatening until our body is able to understand what it is, right? If we've never encountered a stimulus, we are going to have a threat response towards that stimulus until we know inherently that it's safe, right? So we've got high stress and we've got novel stress that are going to cause a threat response. And the response that you're going to get from a physiological perspective here are things like increased body temperature, increased heart rate, blood pressure, and peripheral blood flow, right? So body's going to go away from your central cavity into your arms and legs. And part of that is your heart rate and your actual like blood pressure pumping those out. That's why those things also elevate. And then we've got higher blood glucose levels. We've got higher amygdala activity from a brain perspective, adrenaline and noradrenaline production, and glucocorticoid and cortisol production are all going to increase under a sympathetic response, right? Decreased digestive function, and a lot of that has to do with reduced blood flow from the central cavity, again, as it's going peripheral. Decreased libido, because again, your body's not going to dedicate any energy to things like sex drive if it thinks you're running from danger, right? That doesn't matter anymore. And prefrontal cortex activity, right? So again, you're going to become more amygdala dominant and less cortical dominant. So your decision-making skills are also going to decrease, and you're going to be more of a linear reactive thinker when it comes to that perspective, right? So this response is ideal for short-term use, right? Again, getting out of danger, fight or flight, rather than prolonged activity, right? So we don't necessarily want to stay here for extreme bouts of time. We want to go in and out of this state. So prolonged time in this state may lead to chronic disruption of cardiovascular function and blood glucose regulation, as well as digestive and libido dysregulation, right? And as we're going through things like digestive and libido dysregulation, right, that's going to be an interoceptive stressor, which is going to lead to more perceived stress, which is going to lead to more real stress. And that's where we get things like we call like a vicious cycle, right? Where your own symptoms are leading to more symptoms and probably more extreme symptoms over time. And when we look at a lot of chronic disease and especially when we start looking at like metabolic disease, things like cardiovascular disease and diabetes, right? When we start looking at a lot of these sympathetic increases, right? We start looking at blood glucose levels, increased blood pressure, increased resting heart rate, increased cortisol production. A lot of these things kind of start adding up there as well, where maybe these are actually going to be contributors to a lot of those things if we're in prolonged states there, right? Again, that's something that is probably correlated. There's a lot of research going on there, but I don't think we've seen anything that's completely causal. There's obviously a lot of other external factors, but things to think about with your clients, especially if you're working in a like general weight loss or type demographic, right? Looking at the other end of the spectrum, we're going to get into the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is where we start talking about the rest and digest response, right? And this is going to act as a dampening system, right? So this is going to be the response and the state that we spend a lot of our time in. Again, not all of our time in, but this response acts to regulate the body back into a homeostatic norm, right? So this increases centralized blood flow for normalized digestive function, libido, and cognitive function, right? So we're going back from amygdala into cortical function. Everything else is increasing, digestion increases. And then we're looking at decreased muscular tonicity, so peripheral flow. So that blood's coming out of arms, legs, etc., back into the central cavity. Decreased heart rate and blood pressure. Again, those things can slow down. Decreased blood glucose production and increased insulin production as a regulation agent, and decreased amygdala function and decreased adrenaline, glucocorticoid, and cortisol production, right? So all of these things are going to decrease. It's going to bring us back to a homeostatic norm and a homeostatic function. And this response acts as more of a resting state. It's going to be more homeostatic. It's going to be a lower energy expenditure and lower stimulatory. And again, the low energy expenditure is something that we need to keep in mind, because when we start looking at like what our body wants to do, its main function is conserving energy, right? So even looking at things like training and seeking out activities, like these are things that actually kind of go against a lot of the things that our body wants to do, because in the past, it's typically been things that we had to do from a reactive standpoint as well, right? So again, that's where we have to have bouts of stress to drive higher energy expenditure, because we're not necessarily always going to do it on our own. And our body's not necessarily capable of doing it without an external or internal stimulus to do it with, right? Whether that's a barbell or whether that's, a dog chasing you down the street, doesn't necessarily matter from that standpoint. Anything to add there, Matt?
Nope.
Just a bunch of nerd shit.
Just a bunch of nerd shit.
And
like, here's the thing about all of this stuff is I guess I do have one thing to add. Like, it's stuff that you need to know, but it's stuff that you can't really control. Right. So like you can do some like nervous system shifting stuff, and you can do some nervous system work, but like the processes that happen or that are released or that happen when the nervous system is in one of the states are going to happen no matter what happens. Right. So like you can't change the way that your nervous system responds to certain things.
I think it's more of trying to understand how we can leverage
exactly
these things, right?
When to make it contextually appropriate, when to leverage it to your maximum ability, and when to turn it off when necessary.
Yeah, like when do we want to drive sympathetic tone? When do we not? Right. So again, like two easy examples for this would be like, again, like if you're walking up to a bar on a platform and you've got a heavy load to lift, you want to drive some sympathetic tone, right? Like you want to get excited. And again, that's where things like, loud music, ammonia salts and shit like that, like those will do it for you.
That's why they exist.
That's why back in the day, and sometimes I think even currently, people would slap people on the back and shit like that, because it literally just drives a sympathetic response to the individual, right? Now, if I'm going to be running a marathon and I'm on the starting line, I don't want to be totally sympathetic, because I'm going to use a lot of energy just trying to regulate myself, right? I don't want to go into a race with an increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased tonicity, and increased peripheral blood flow, because that's actually going to force me to accumulate fatigue even faster through that process, right? So if I'm doing something that's more capacity based, while I'm still going to be probably more sympathetic than I am sitting on my couch reading or whatever, snuggling with my dog, which is about as parasympathetic as I can possibly get. I don't want to be as sympathetic as I am if I'm going to try to like max out my deadlift. Those are two very different environmental stimuluses and goal selections, right? So again, I think that's where, like, if I can try some dampening things prior to an endurance race, that might be worthwhile. And I might try some excitatory things prior to, a strength or power output based thing. That might be worthwhile, right? So again, these things are really looking at how to leverage these activities and make them work for you a little better. I think that's what we're trying to do as coaches, but also just having the self-awareness of understanding, like, neither one of these things is inherently good or bad. you're going to be in both, hopefully, if you're a healthy individual, right? It's just when we start getting a lack of alignment between the environment and the task you're in versus the state you're in from an autonomic standpoint, that's where we might be in a situation where we might want to change some things or rethink some things. So this is just an easy picture because I like pictures. I think most people like pictures, but we can kind of look through what's happening during a parasympathetic and a sympathetic shift. And these are some things that you would notice. And even like the pupils, right? This is why when, police or whoever, or doctors will check pupils on a potential patient or somebody in front of them as well, because they can kind of understand. Because the other big thing that, impacts our autonomic nervous system are drugs. And we will see things like dilation and constriction based on some of these things, right? So parasympathetic, you're going to be looking at essentially a lot of constriction, right? So we're going to have constriction because we want to decrease peripheral blood flow, right? So you'll see constriction kind of throughout this activity, right? Where we will have constriction of the pupils, we'll have constriction of the bronchia, we will have constriction of the urinary bladder. We'll also have increased saliva production, right? And that has to do with increased digestive function as well, because saliva is your first digestive enzyme, essentially. We'll be looking at reduced heart rate, right? So the cardiovascular system in general is going to be dampened. We're going to be looking at stimulated digestive organs. We want to increase that, stimulates activity of the pancreas and gallbladder and all of those other kind of organisms that, the liver is probably going to be impacted in there as well. And then we're going to be looking at constriction of the bladder. And then we're going to be looking at, erection, essentially. From a sympathetic standpoint, this is where we have a lot of dilation, where blood flow is going to be pushed out, right? So we'll have, dilation again at the pupils, but also at the bronchia. And then if we have increases in heart rate, we probably also have vascular dilation happening too, right? And then we're going to have inhibition basically of everything digestive, right? So again, the organs, the pancreas, the gallbladder, we're going to have stimulation of the adrenal medulla, release of adrenaline and noradrenaline. Again, those kind of anticipatory, neurotransmitters, and then relaxation of the urinary bladder, and then stimulation of orgasm, right? So again, even intercourse, you're going from one to another, right? Like that's variability, at the means, right? So again, like these are things that should work in coordination with one another as you go back and forth throughout the course of, not just a day, but really down to the hour, and sometimes even less than that, with a lot of this stuff. So pictures are good. Hopefully that breaks some things down a little bit. We'll talk again, like this is something that I've been talking about, since the beginning of this call, but really we're looking at how these things function together, right? So these branches are often thought of as competing, but the new research has determined they're actually complementary to one another. To reiterate, we fluctuate between the two states both acutely, so even down to, again, heart rate and respiration cycles in prolonged periods throughout the day under normal circumstances, and that's going to be our variability. And then we start looking at everything from, again, inhalation is going to be sympathetic, exhalation is going to be parasympathetic. This is how we use heart rate variability, HRV, as a proxy for autonomic state. So if you use a Whoop band or Elite HRV or really any other HRV device, what that thing is trying to do is essentially measure your heart rate variability. And that's where you're going to be getting the score. And essentially it functions as a mechanism for understanding how recovered you are, right? So again, the more variability you have, the more readiness you have for more stress. The less variability you have, the less readiness you're going to have for more stress, because you're already in a stressed state typically. That being said, a lot of HR devices are also complete garbage, and probably something that you don't necessarily need to invest in. That's something I've used a lot of these in the past. I've had a lot of experience with not only the products, but also the vendors and the people, the engineers even behind the technology at times. And these are, for the most part, wildly inaccurate when it comes to actually measuring these things, especially something that's going to be wrist or finger display. Is going to be a very hard time actually looking at things. If it's going off capillaries, it's not necessarily going to be giving you an accurate measure or proxy of what's going on here. So again, things to consider if you're big into HRV and you love the devices. Not a bad thing. Just don't run your entire life don't make major decisions based off an HRV score.
That's one of the biggest things that you would look at is like, if I'm just looking at an article from the International Journal of Cardiology.com. It is their conclusion with all of this stuff is that you must be very, very cautious when using things like HRV, because it can negatively impact performance if somebody is putting too much stock into it.
Yeah. I mean,
especially if it's a non-ECG wearable device, those ones are very inaccurate.
Yeah. And like I used to use Omega Wave, which was an ECG with a heart rate monitor. I think it's probably the best of the bunch, but it's also the unit that I was using for myself and my clients was a $3,000 unit.
Yep.
It wasn't one that, again, was I could buy at Target and wear around, right? So again, these are very different. There's very different levels of accuracy with these, and again, if you're going to look at trends over time. Don't look at them from an acute daily basis. If you're waking up, looking at your score, and then dictating your activity that day based off of it, you're probably looking at it way too acutely,
right?
Because the other way that our body can start building resilience and adaptation is by sometimes working really hard when we're not necessarily posting the best HRV scores.
Right. And that's one of the things that I would look at if we're looking at things like a Whoop. And that's one of the things that I dislike the most about that one is that it gives you your daily score, and it will literally tell you shouldn't train today, take today light.
Yeah.
Right. And like it's like exactly like Kyle was saying, like a small dosage or a small sample size. It's just like looking at like a study, right? If you guys are reading a study and you guys are looking at the group, and the group is 4 people, that's probably going to be a garbage study compared to like if the results are the same out of a group of 400 or 1,000 people, right? You want to look at the larger group as the better sample size, or the larger sample size is the better outcome. So it's the same thing where if you're looking at this, like you guys are using a Whoop, collect like 90 days of data and look at your trend. Are you mostly green or are you mostly red? That's where you would end up having to start making more lifestyle changes based off of that.
Do you see that you're red on Mondays and Tuesdays,
mm-hmm.
and get greener throughout the week, right? Maybe your weekends are a problem at that point, right? There's definitely things you can pick up from these. Whoop in general, from people who understand HRV, is basically thought of as having also if anybody, hopefully nobody is offended by this, but the best marketing, but the worst algorithm.
Yeah.
Within all these companies. Yeah. So again, kind of keep that in mind. Not to get too far down the rabbit hole there, but so both external stimulus and internal stimulus can put us in a longer duration period of sympathetic activity. I mentioned that earlier as well. So again, this is something where I think, things like social media and news that reaches, international levels, the internet, there's a lot to be said, and a lot of sociologists and anthropologists. God, I can never say
anthropologists.
That. Yes, Jesus. Like a lot of them are kind of under the idea that our brains aren't necessarily wired to handle and understand what's going on halfway around the world from us, because there's nothing we can do about it directly, right? So there are a lot of people out there that have a ton of just piled up perceived stress all the time about things that they cannot directly control. And that's kind of a recipe for disaster for a lot of human beings, right? Because it's like, again, like our bodies are kind of like, we're hungry, we go eat. We're sleepy, we sleep. We feel like we're threatened, we run or we fight, right? It's a very direct and linear path. Whereas if we see something that's happening, half a world away, or even, 10 miles away in some cases, that we can't directly impact in a positive way, yet it's still a stressor in our lives, like that becomes very problematic very quickly for a lot of people.
Very fast.
Where you have a lot of people with extreme levels of, everything from just anxiety to actual psychosis, for things that don't actually directly impact them in any way, right? It may never even happen, right? Because again, it may be something we're just predicting to happen, or something that we're anticipating potentially happening, or something of that nature. So again, these are things, and there's a lot of research in the psychology realm that kind of goes into this and how much these things are impacting us. But technology and the use of technology is still new enough that I don't think anyone really knows to the extent that these things are happening. But again, like, just think about how easily, like, we can get triggered from a social media post, or how, like, think about how social media makes you feel sometimes, or how news of like something happening in another country can impact your day. Like, these are all things that, again, like, without technology being what it is, we'd probably never know.
Yeah.
Right. So again, like, there's a context, and there's definitely, what, like, it's nice to kind of look at a lot of this stuff from 1,000-foot view, because if you dig into it, you end up kind of wanting to go live in the woods by yourself, or at least I do. And and just not paying attention to any of it. But there's a lot of rationale there, to decreasing a lot of that time, with, screens and everything else, based on the amount and types of information we typically get and how it's being delivered to us. So food for thought there. But again, things like hunger, discomfort, external stimulus, cognitive, emotional stimulation through social media, the news, these are all things that can drive a ton of sympathetic activity. Some of them you can do things about, and some of them that you might not be able to, and that can be problematic, as we just mentioned. So, getting into the nitty gritty, we can talk a little bit about how we would actually use this as a training application, because again, like Matt and I kind of both said, I think there are some ways where you can leverage it a little bit, and then potentially avoid some things, based on training protocols, if you see somebody who tends to bias one way or another. So what we look at here is training is typically going to be a sympathetic activity relative to the norm. Again, it's a continuum. So some things are going to be way more sympathetic than others based on the actual application of the training and what somebody wants to get out of it. But we can use a controlled application exposures of stressor as a means for further adaptation over time, right? So novelty for movement competency and motor learning. This is where we want to expose people to new things in a low risk environment. So usually, again, when I say low risk, the stimulus itself is way down, right? So when we think about, and it makes sense, if we're showing somebody something that they've never done before, it's a brand new exposure to an exercise. We're doing it with a pretty light weight, if not body weight, in a lot of ways, just to make sure the person kind of understands what's supposed to happen, because it's easier to learn, within that context. So we're looking at movement competency and motor learning from that perspective. So things like coordination, things like understanding, like, kind of the vestibular mechanisms happening within a movement. And then we look at things like progressive overload for progressive application of stress as adaptation takes place, right? In progressive overload, we think a lot of weights, but we can also look a lot at volume over time from that perspective. So there's different ways that we can kind of apply that principle. Clients who come in with a higher degree of threat response or hypervigilance, so that's going to be more anticipatory, may need dampening prior to a consult or training. This is something where we see, like, if you guys have ever heard of like white coat syndrome in the medical industry, this is kind of something where people go into a doctor's office, and if they're very fearful or threatened of doctors in hospital settings and medical settings, they're going to display things like very high blood pressure, very high resting heart rate, et cetera, and they might get misdiagnosed for some of these things, right? So similar thing might happen in the training environment. If you've got a client or you work with a client base that has a very low training age and maybe feels very uncomfortable in a gym setting, right? Where if they're hypersympathetic, you might also see, altered movement competency and decision-making abilities based on increased tonicity for peripheral blood flow, right? Where somebody might not have as many, degrees of freedom or movement options, based on just how toned up they are. And then someone in a hypersympathetic state may also have a lower threshold for increased hypersympathetic activity. So again, if you have somebody who is way overhyped, they might actually have decreased performance when they're actually trying to train or max out something or whatever, right? Display a lot of force production or output or whatever. So these are things where, again, you might want to get that person a little bit more closer to baseline so they actually have a higher threshold of improvement as they go through that process.
I actually just posted a study in the Discord about HRV, and it is kind of related to this because a lot of what we'll talk about is people who end up having more of a botched HRV and who are not in the best state for them to start training, end up losing a lot more fine motor control. And they don't lose a lot more fine motor control, but people who function better, who have a higher HRV and more regulation between the two, have better better fine and gross motor control on average than people who do not.
Yeah.
Which ends up going exactly in with this. Like the more sympathetic you are at more times, the less likely you are to be able to really exhibit fine motor control. So more complex tasks will start to break down much faster.
Yeah, because you are fighting or flighting.
Yep.
You are not painting a picture or sculpting.
You're not playing guitar.
Yeah, like you're very linear from that perspective. Yeah. And again, like when you start thinking about it, it all starts making sense, right? When you think about your own personal experiences and exposures from a training and lifestyle perspective, like you will see a lot of things that from your own experience that are probably going to match this pretty well. And, again, hopefully that there's some context that's going to be delivered there. And then, another thing that, Matt and I talk about a lot, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit even as we go through like the assessment aspect of things, but mobility is obviously a huge topic in the industry, and everybody wants to do mobility drills. Everybody fights over what mobility drills are the best drills and what system is the best system and yada, yada, yada. And the reality of it is, when we start looking at things like static stretching, we start looking at things like SMR or manual therapy of any kind. We start looking at FRC based work and again, very controlled movements. We start looking at things like respiration based drills. Like a lot of these things aren't necessarily, again, increasing or decreasing tissue length as much as they're dampening tonicity within tissues.
Yep.
And, again, if we're looking at stretching and we're looking at, SMR or pressure based modalities, like we're looking at a Golgi tendon reflex typically, where we are essentially disrupting the stretch shortening cycle and decreasing tonicity within the tissue to allow for the tissue to lengthen within the range of motion that you're trying to lengthen or stretch or whatever, right? When we start looking at things like respiration based, like that's another thing that we're going to talk about here in a second. We're looking at essentially a polyvagal reaction where if we're focusing on exhales and deep exhalations, we're typically looking at a parasympathetic reaction, right? And things that are also going to lead to more of a global parasympathetic shift and tissue dampening from that perspective. We start looking at things like FRC, we're usually looking at reciprocal inhibition, right? Where we're looking at driving activity or tension within one set of tissues to decrease tonicity within their reciprocal tissues, right? To increase range of motion.
I think that's one of the biggest things that people seem to forget about when we start discussing the majority of these movement systems is that all of them end up kind of eliciting the exact same response. It's just which one do you seem to prefer or which one do you like the most?
Or which one do your clients like the most?
Right. Like I use FRC drills with certain people. I use PRI drills with other people. I use none with other people. Like I use all of them because some people like them more than others.
I got some people who still foam roll because they fucking love that shit.
Yep.
Like it's cool. Like again, like we start looking at mobility, especially if we're looking at it from a movement prep perspective, whatever gets the job done.
Yeah.
Like if you can get under a bar and work your way up and warm up that way, that's fantastic. If you're somebody who likes to do something else and do something else, as long as it leads to better training, cool. Like that's really, and we talked about this a little bit in week one. At the end of the day, like I don't care what system people use or if they use a system at all. I care about their training because the training's the show. The training's where the stress is actually being applied. Mobility drills in general are actually where stress is being dampened, right? That's actually where we're trying to decrease stimulus and decrease tonicity, right? So again, these are things that are kind of working within opposite realms to an extent sometimes where, we can warm up a lot of different ways as far as driving sympathetic tone, But mobility drills in general are going to be doing the opposite thing, where we want to increase parasympathetic tone in a lot of ways. And those are going to be the main differentiators between kind of the two, between, foam rolling versus getting on an assault bike and just ramping up your heart rate and et cetera before you go do something.
Speaking of that, I actually have a friend who's a pretty high level DPT who is actually very, very evidence based and changes his opinion very often based off of new evidence that comes out on different treatment methods and all sorts of stuff like that. And he foam rolls. You know why he foam rolls? Because it feels good. And he's foam rolled every single session before he works out. And he doesn't think that it's important. He doesn't think that it's necessary. He just says, I like how it makes me feel. I feel really good during and after.
And again, this is where the client application probably matters greatly, because people do things they enjoy doing with much more intention than doing things they don't enjoy doing in general. Right. Again, and trainers are kind of weirdos, where we drive a lot of intention sometimes into things we don't like doing, but we're also weirdos and we're not the norms.
I don't know. How many of you guys actually push Bulgarian split squats very heavy or very hard?
That's true. Sometimes we like to
say we do. But like,
yeah.
I did lunges yesterday, and I did them with literally body weight, because I was like, well, I'm going to justify why I'm going to do the body weight. I don't like to.
I don't need those 100-pound dumbbells.
That's heavy. I don't want to do that. That's a lot of work.
I'm tired. So again, it's like, if your clients like to do something, they'll probably do it better and get better results from it. Again, like, we're going to talk about that concept with exercise selection, a bunch of other shit as we go through especially in the Gen Pop programming, probably. Because specificity,
not so much on today's, but on Mondays for sure.
On next week. So
just so you guys are aware,
that's going to be an ongoing concept.
Yes.
So getting out of autonomics and getting into respiration, these things work hand in hand a lot of ways, but they are different systems. They just are connected. So respiration in general revolves around two main mechanisms: inhalation and exhalation. So we all know that. You inhale, you exhale, and allows for the regulation of many of the body's systems. And that's through, essentially respiration being a modulator for the autonomic nervous system, right? We can control kind of our sympathetic and parasympathetic tone to an extent through inhalation and exhalation strategies. And again, this is nothing new. Like yoga, Tai Chi, like even prayer, to an extent from a religious perspective, has been leveraging these things for literally tens to hundreds of thousands of years, right? So none of this stuff's new. It didn't start with the fitness industry in any way. It's something that people have been doing for a very long time. And people found out a very long time ago, right? So inhalation is the process in which we bring oxygen into the body, and exhalation is the process in which we expel waste gas from the body. So when we start looking at, how these two things function together, they don't compete. They are complementary to one another, as you will see in a lot of the systems that we talk about, similar to the ANS and PNS, et cetera. So compromised inhalation will further disrupt exhalation, while compromised exhalation will disrupt inhalation, right? So these things are going to positively or negatively impact one another from an efficacy standpoint. So when we start looking at, essentially your inhalation mechanics and disruption, we're actually probably looking at CO2 tolerance in a lot of ways. And again, I'm not going to go super, super deep into that, but your ability to tolerate CO2 in your system is probably going to be one of the things that actually positively impacts your ability to both inhale and exhale over time and kind of go through that process efficiently. I have highlighted two books that are very different from one another. One of them is very clinical and very sciencey, and that's Recognizing and Treating Breathing Disorders. And that's a university level text that you can get on Amazon, and it'll go into the nitty gritty on all the biomechanics and all the physiology involved in the process. And then another book that is more entertaining and more story driven, and a little more just like woo-ish in a lot of ways, is Breathe by James Nestor. And he will go into, he goes into a lot of those same things, but looks at it from a lot of different lenses. And it's a little more entertainment driven. It's a much more, I think, enjoyable read if you're just looking to kind of get a little more surface level idea of kind of what's going on there.
If you guys haven't read anything by James Nestor ever, he's a fantastic author.
He's a great author.
He's
a great writer in general. But that one is one that, again, is probably going to be something that would be more of I would start with that one as an intro to kind of this stuff. So the other big thing that respiration does and respiration mechanics do when we start looking at the diaphragm is respiration is also a means for the body to regulate pressure within the thoracolumbar cavity. So your central cavity, your stomach, your quote unquote core, right? That's what we're referring to when we say thoracolumbar cavity. I'm probably not going to say thoracolumbar again until the next time we teach this presentation, because it's a stupid word.
That is often as I use it as well.
Yeah. So we're going to say core. The volume of gas within a cavity is inversely proportional, right, to the pressure within the cavity. So these are inverse relationships. So more gas, less pressure, less gas. When the volume of the lungs increases, so think about an inhalation, the pressure within the lungs decreases, right? When the volume decreases, the pressure increases, and the pressure is what helps push waste gas out of your system as it kind of, again, constricts the lungs. So this process creates a vacuum that is largely regulated by the diaphragm, auxiliary respiratory muscles, so all your abs, right? So your obliques, your rectus, all of it, and the structures of the rib cage and pelvis and the pelvic floor. These things are all going to work kind of together to create the vacuum that allows you to inhale and exhale and create interabdominal pressure, or IAP, if that's a fitness term that we can kind of relate to this. So again, nice little picture because I love pictures. Air goes in, the diaphragm descends down, and you can kind of see this picture actually does a good job of also kind of highlighting the fact that the diaphragm as a neutral structure is in a state of ascension most of the time. It's not just flat. So it's slightly ascended. So when it descends down, right? Abdominals typically will expand out, and that's more of a 360 movement. And then the pelvic floor relaxes down, right? So everything kind of goes down and out. When you exhale, the diaphragm returns up, right? Now we're forcing everything out. So the diaphragm helps constrict the lungs to force everything out. The abdominals contract in and the pelvic floor lifts up, right? So everything's up and in, from an exhalation standpoint. So I like this visual, very easy. Again, it's not super nuanced, but it's probably as nuanced as we need to be right now from this perspective.
That brings us all the way back to one of the things that we talked about on the very first, earlier in the program of, is it important or is it useful?
Yeah. This is about the utility that most of us are going to use this stuff for a gym pop client. Again,
I would even argue for a lot more high level clients as well.
No, a non therapy related client.
Yes.
It would be a better description there. A person who's otherwise healthy.
Yes.
That's what we're looking at. So,
normal ass person.
Yeah.
AKA all of our demographics.
Yes. So rib cage and diaphragm, again, kind of looking at the structure. The main thing that I like to highlight here again is the diaphragm's asymmetrical, right? So again, we're looking at a right side that has a much larger attachment point and a much larger dome, and the dome is elevated, right, over the left dome, right? So it's even over a different rib, right? We look at this, it makes sense, right? Because essentially we have a heart up here and we have a liver down here. When we even look at the lungs and the structure of the lungs, the left lung has another lobe. It's got a whole nother lobe than the right lung does, right? So we are asymmetrical organisms inherently, right? So again, if you're chasing symmetry, you're always going to be kind of chasing a ghost, right? We can have levels of symmetry and levels of asymmetry, but we're all inherently asymmetrical. Most of us have no issues from it, from a negative standpoint, right? So again, like this is going to be things that allow for even more rotation sometimes. and definitely impact things like gait. And that's going to be something we talk about later in the program. But again, this visual is good just because it shows this in a very real way that's easy to see here. When we look at the pelvis and we look at the pelvic floor, and again, the pelvic floor is just going to be a bunch of muscles that crisscross this big hole here, right? We're looking at the iliums, right? We're looking at the ischiums, and then we're looking at the pubis, right? So these are going to be the parts of the pelvis. This is the SI joint here. It is semi-fused. It doesn't move a whole lot between the sacrum and the actual iliums. And then we have the actual like where the actual, you know, kind of the pubis connects. And this is going to be something that is a little bit more flexible. It opens up obviously during childbirth for women, but this is going to be, again, kind of loosely flexible, and is going to allow for a little bit more internal and external rotation of the actual iliums themselves as we go through, again, breathing, gait, all the good things. But I cannot reiterate enough, when we're talking about movement within these joints, we're talking generally in normal contexts about millimeters of movement. The reason this thing is able to move so much and open up during childbirth is because a woman produces a shit ton of relaxin and other hormones that increase essentially the ability for the mobility of connective tissues, you know, throughout that process, right? So again, like that's going to be something that during that period, you're going to have increased ranges of motion, flexibility, movement. But under normal circumstances, you're not necessarily going to have those things. Again, the acetabulum, that's another one. We'll talk about this a little bit in lower body skeletal, but that's where the femur head connects into and inserts into the pelvis as well. So looking at inhalation and exhalation a little closer. So during inhalation, kind of as we talked about on our picture, the diaphragm descends into a flattened position from a domed position, right? The rib cage elevates and expands. So think about taking a big breath. You're going to elevate, expand. You're going to widen a little bit. The pelvic floor descends. The iliums externally rotate and the sacrum counter-nutates. Again, those are going to be processes that are pretty small and you probably can't see visually. And when I say probably can't see visually, I'm going to say you can't see them visually, especially from a sacral perspective. The process increases the volume within the lungs, decreases the pressure, and creates a vacuum that can be leveraged for further exhalation, right at the other end of the spectrum. During exhalation, the diaphragm ascends as the rib cage depresses. So again, take a super long exhale really quick and you'll feel everything go down and out. You'll feel your abdomen, your oblique, all of those kind of accessory muscles start flexing to help force more air out. The pelvic floor ascends, the iliums internally rotate and the sacrum nutates. This process decreases the volume within the lungs while increasing the pressure. Pressure forces out and is also facilitated by the abdominal complex, right? So primarily the obliques, but also the rectus and the auxiliary musculature along the rib cage. So now we're looking like intercostals, also kind of constricting and contracting the rib cage to force more air out of the lungs. So all of these things work in a big system. Really looking at Boyle's law, if you guys go back to, you know, chemistry 101, when we start talking about a lot of this stuff. So when we look at structural asymmetries, and again, this is something where we see because of the asymmetry within the diaphragm and the rib cage, very common patterns start presenting themselves. How much do they actually matter? It depends on a lot of other things, most likely. So the structure of the diaphragm may contribute to varying degrees the resting structure and position of the rib cage and pelvis. So sometimes you'll see a little bit of rotation in both of those things, usually counter rotation one another. A common compensatory strategy that we often see involves the following. If you guys are familiar with PRI, this would be a LAIC or a left AIC, or just an AIC because there are no right AIC patterns, right? So what we typically see here is right internal rotation and left external rotation of the rib cage. So the left rib flares out a little bit. right scapular protraction, humeral IR as a resting state, left scapular retraction, humeral ER is a resting state, right external rotation, left internal rotation of the pelvis. We've got a counter rotation there, right femoral internal rotation, tibial internal rotation, and calcaneal eversion, left femoral ER, tibial ER, and calcaneal inversion. And then we have a little bit of left cervical rotation, right? How much does it actually matter? For most people, not at all, right? And I think this is something that when we start looking at training applications, like how much of this do I care about? I only care about it if I see it as a limiter, right? And I think that's just like anything else, right? Just like anything else that I would look at, right? Whether it's anterior pelvic tilt or whatever, if I'm looking at something structural, if it's not a limiter to performance from my estimation based on the assessment and kind of what I'm taking them through from an assessment perspective and a testing perspective, I'm not really going to address it any differently than I would any of their other training. You know, and I think that's where at that point, if it is a limiter and maybe they don't have the rotation capacity that they need for their activities or their sport or whatever, that would be something where I can very easily drive rotation-based exercises and probably counteract a lot of these things, or unilateral exercises or alternating reciprocal exercise. Like there's a lot of different things that I can do from a training perspective where I can apply stress rather than doing just nothing but correctives, right? So again, if somebody is in a ton of pain from something like this, it's probably not your scope anyway.
Right.
And that's when I would refer out personally.
That's a big one.
So
that's a big one.
We talk about it. We want to be aware about it. What it actually looks like from a training perspective may not be much. Yeah. It may not matter that much, right? So again, this is where you as a coach have to make a decision of how much you want to care about all of these things based on how much it's impacting your client's performance.
Kyle has a really good rant on how all of these things come back to goblet squats.
Yeah. Doesn't matter what system you're doing, you're going to wind up with a heel elevated goblet squat as a corrective exercise. So just give that to your person as their first squat anyway, and just roll with it.
When we get to the Gen Pop case study, we will see if that or not.
Yeah, we'll look at some things. All right, so if anybody does have questions on this, we can definitely address them. You guys can go ahead and write them in the chat. Matt's probably going to go ahead and just start kind of talking about the GP a little bit as we're kind of thinking over these things. But
yeah, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get into this one.
If you guys do have questions, though, type them in and we'll definitely address them.
So the case study that I kind of wanted to go over today was just the very, very basic, and I even wrote it out here, the 1 month basic Gen Pop template, right? So what we're looking at doing here is we have okay, let me just back this up a little bit, right? We've all done in-person coaching. We've all done general population coaching specifically, or at least the vast majority of us have. And one of the things that ends up being very, very frustrating as a coach, or frustrating as a trainer, is when you have those clients that come in that do not have any standardized or tangible goals. So, and you can't get to them. Like no matter how much you dig into them, no matter how much you do, no matter how much you can find, there is no answer, and they just do not have anything that they particularly really strongly care about. So what we struggle with is we struggle with making really informed programming decisions with those people, because how do I program out for something that has no specificity whatsoever? Like if you want to do a 5K, I can program out for a 5K. If you want to deadlift 100 pounds, I can program out for that. If you want to learn how to get your first pull-up or 30 push-ups, we can do all of that stuff. But a lot of times we will get clients that come in with nothing tangible or nothing really specific. So what we have to do is we have to also be able to program out for those people specifically. So what I do, and the way that I kind of approach all of these programs, is I approach them all with a little bit more of a systemic training focus through just general physical preparedness, right? And what we're talking about when we're looking at general physical preparedness is the terminology that we're using here ends up being fairly important, right? So general physical preparedness does not mean that I'm just throwing out a bunch of random bullshit. right? General physical preparedness means that I'm exposing them to a high amount of different movements, and I'm training a ton of different tissues, and I'm trying to build up just general physical qualities, right? So I'm looking at training quads, I'm looking at training hamstrings, I'm looking at training lats, I'm squatting, we're deadlifting, we're doing a lot of different movements. We're trying to build up a lot of different motor competencies and a lot of different movement patterns and expose them to a lot of different movement patterns to give them the best ability to really work through and express force and really like work on, again, one of the other things that we can also start tangentially talking about with this is how the stronger you get and the more movements you're exposed to, the better your coordination is going to become, and how these people are just going to slightly start becoming more athletic over time because they're just being exposed to a higher degree of movements, and they're learning how to like move their body and manipulate their body in space as we go through all of these different movements, which is very important. But one of the things that we want to look at with this is the general physical preparedness module or program that I'm kind of putting them through ends up being so non-specific that it also ends up being really, 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 really hard, right? Like looking at this program, doing something like this, if we were to sub out the exercise selection to make it something more appropriate for somebody like Kyle or myself, or any of you guys on this call, this would kill you. Like this would be very, very fatiguing. Like as an example, I'm going through, and I'll review this in my week of training review this week, but I'm going through a bit of a systemic stimulus right now for a bit of a deload. And like the weights that I'm using are so much lower than the weights that I would normally be using on more of a neurological phase or more of like any other phase of training, just simply because my limiter ends up being my cardiovascular system, which is what these people are going to experience here. So looking at them going through a general physical preparedness phase with a high degree of exposure to different movements, we're going to be looking at training the cardiovascular system through a baseline level of movement and getting the exercise selection targeted in a way that's going to be more through peripheral heart action that'll give them the ability to work through some, again, not quite as good as actual cardiovascular adaptations and not quite as good as actual cardiovascular training, but they will develop some cardiovascular adaptations to this. They will also start developing some muscular adaptations to this, and they'll also develop some capacity-based adaptations to this. So we are looking at trying to train multiple different qualities with them all at the same time. We're looking at improving a bunch of different things with them all at the same time. And we're looking at just making them a generally more robust human being or individual as they go through this training program. Now, what we're looking at with this is I program out all of these things through peripheral heart action, and I'm going to use a rotating A-B-C split. Right, so I do 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 1, 3, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 1, 3, 1, 2, and then back to 1, 2, 3. Right, so it's A, B, C, B, C, A, C, A, B, back to A, B, C. If we want to break it down a little bit easier. So each one of these are going to be varied by the day slightly. So we just have a slight variance in rep range. So we go from 15s to 12s to 10s. And again, the stimulus of this ends up being close enough to the same that they're still getting exposure to a light, medium, and heavy day, but it all ends up being within the same rep range that would be training with normally. And the reason why I've chosen this rep range for these people is if they're very new and they're very, very, very green to training, I probably don't want to throw them into heavy like 5s or 1s or triples right off the bat because they just have no competency in the movements to begin with. So we want to start at the easiest area that we can. And the easiest thing that we can do to start ensuring quality movement over time is just give them exposure to more reps, which is another reason why I've taken this 3-day approach where we're doing each movement pattern on each day to give them a little bit more exposure so they build a little bit more autonomy when it comes to actually starting to train and actually starting to move their body in space. So if we go through day 1, which is the light day, this is going to be pretty freaking hard. They have a goblet squat, so they just have a bilateral knee dominant exercise, a single arm lat pull down, so a unilateral pull. We can talk about vertical, horizontal, or 45-degree, or like whatever we want to, and exercise selection weeks. We can get to that a little bit more specifically there because we definitely will. Then we have a 45-degree hip extension where we're looking at like training the shortened position of the glutes, right? So we have, depending on stance, lengthened position of the glutes and quads here. We have shortened position of the glutes and quads here. Then we have some lats here. And the reason why I'm looking at going through all 3 of these is I want them to just work on training the upper body and the lower body in like simultaneously. If we're looking at somebody who's much more adept and much more skilled at training, if I'm putting them through some sort of a systemic phase, it would go compound movement to isolation movement that's not generally related to that exercise individual, that exercise normally. But if we're looking at a general physical preparedness template for a Gen Pop client, it probably doesn't really matter that much because they are just so bad at exercise that everything is going to be challenging, and they are so bad at exercise that they are going to also benefit from everything that you make them do. So looking
Newbie
at this,
gains.
yeah, newbie gains, that's the best. So with this, I also don't have any rest periods written out or any tempo written out or anything like that written out whatsoever. The reason I do not have anything like that written out for any of these people is because I am aware that cardio is going to be that person's limiter. So I'm not going to time their rests, but I'm going to time them, if that makes sense. So what I mean by that is I'm not going to say you have 90 seconds rest in between these things. I'm going to say we rested for 1 minute and 34 seconds between a series. And then I'm going to say we rested 2 minutes and 56 seconds between B series, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to track their rest period. I'm going to track how long they rested, and I'm going to assess that every single sequential session so I can make sure that we are actually working on the end, like building the stamina and building the capacity that we want to build to see how they are doing when they're coming through this. Right? So I'm not going to actually prescribe out timed rest, but I will be aware of it and I will be timing it and I will let them go when they're ready. Particularly with general population clients, depending on the person that you're dealing with, some of them want to feel like you're kicking the shit out of them and some of them don't at all, right? Some of them want to come in and have you just like have them do the bare minimum because that's what they want. Right? So if we're looking at the ones who want to do the bare minimum, I'm going to still be tracking that metric and I'm still going to be looking at progressing that over time, but I'm going to do it through a more subtle way where I'm just aware of the amount of time that it takes them to rest between sets and then start to progress them up over time as they get more into training. Cool. So then after this, we have a seated dumbbell overhead press, a wide grip cable row, and a lying leg curl. Again, upper body, lower body. And then we have biceps, triceps, and abs because everybody wants a big arm pump. Day two, we're going to, so day one, we were obviously prioritizing the knee dominant movement as the first one because I wanted them to have the most exposure to this one. So this is the priority superset. This is the secondary superset, and this is the tertiary set of movements. On day two, our priority movements are going to be the flat dumbbell bench. So they get some example of a horizontal machine press or a horizontal press in general. Then it's going to be a upper body pull and a static split squat, right? So they're going to be doing some sets of 12 on this one. With their static split squat, again, one of the other things people talk to me about this all the time. They're like, oh man, don't you think that static split squats are a bit advanced for a Gen Pop person? I'm like, well, not if they're unloaded and they're holding onto a dowel. Like, not at all. Like, they're just kneeling down, standing up. It's not hard. Like, it's hard and it's fatiguing, but it's not very advanced. Right. And if we're looking at this, I do want to be able to start pushing them and I want to be able to push them into an area where they're going to be working and they're going to be challenged. So I want to start with that relatively early in a highly constrained atmosphere that gives them the most chance at being successful. Right. Then after this, we're going to move on to some dumbbell RDLs, a cable costal pec press, and a seated dumbbell lateral raise, and then more biceps, triceps, and abs. Then day three, slightly heavier. Again, one of the things that I'm looking at is I'm trying to make the sets and reps fit the exercise selection, right? We have trap bar deadlifts, incline dumbbell bench, and a weighted cable or a weighted crunch variant. Then we have single arm dumbbell rows, single arm press arounds because people like them, and then a little bit of arms at the end of the day as well, right? So we're looking at trying to get a little bit of everything in as we're going through each one. I'm trying to pick the variations or the rep ranges that'll hit the most on each one. Again, one of the other things that I'm doing with this one, and the reason why I've chosen 10s on this one, is because we do have a lot of unilateral movements, and nobody likes doing sets of 15 to 20 unilateral movements. Sets of 12 are a little bit aggressive for most Gen Pop people on this one. And so that's why I kind of chose the exercise selection that I chose for these ones. Then as we go through week two, there is no progression in terms of volume, in terms of intensity, or in terms of movement. There is just a rotation in the days. Then in week three, that's the same thing. There is no progression in terms of volume, in terms of exercise selection. There is just a rotation of the days. And in week four, it's the same thing. We are just going back to week one. Now, with this being said, let's start talking about the metrics that I'm looking at tracking so we can ensure that we are progressing over time. The first thing that we want to be aware of when we're looking at progressing a client and we're looking at these people in particular is we want to be very, very cognizant of their training age. So if they have no training age, we are going to be able to progressively load them week to week just because they are novel, like everything is novel to them. So as their nervous system begins to adapt to the movements that they're doing, and as they get to learn the movements better, they will be stronger on it on the next week. And they will be stronger on the third week, and they will be stronger on the fourth week. It's like we talked about with newbie gains. Right. So with this, what I want to make sure that I'm doing is I'm making sure that I'm choosing a weight that is challenging and then I'm progressing it up over time. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm adding 5 pounds per week, especially if we are doing something like tracking rest, because tracking rest is another really easy way that we can ensure a lot of progressive overload. If we are able to, so like, let's say we hit 20,000 pounds of volume in an hour and a half on day one, and then we hit 20,000 pounds of volume in 45 minutes on day 7, right? Or on day 10 of the program. That is a huge progression because we've created a lot more density in that training session, and we've challenged and we've built one adaptation that we could be looking for that particular person. Right. So with this one, weight is not going to be my priority one, but I'm still going to be looking at progressing that one. I'm probably just going to care more about checking their rest periods and making sure that we're progressing their rest periods over time. Again, that's not to say that I'm going to underload the client. I want to make sure that the load is going to be something that they are being challenged by, so that we're not wasting time and we're not just like rushing through all the sets. So I want to make sure the load is challenging, and we are pushing that one up over time, but that's not the priority for me with this particular client as tracking the rest periods would be. Because if I can cut that 2-minute and 56-second rest down between the B series that we just talked about, and if I can cut that down to a minute, that is a huge amount of work that's going to be completed. Right? Because again, one of the other things that you would look at with this is if these people are coming in with a relatively low training age and low exposure to movements in general, this is going to be a large shock to the system, and they're probably not going to make it through everything. So then the first major progression for them before they're able to even start doing anything else would be make it through the session. And we can start looking at doing things where we're doing body part splits a little bit more specifically or breaking it down a little bit more like that. But I don't think that's really something that's necessary for a lot of the general population people that are coming into you, especially if they do not have any tangible or specific goals. Kyle, anything you want to jump in on?
No, I think the part that you just said, literally, like, make sure that they can make it through the session is valuable. Like, even when I've worked with people in the past, especially in person, like I've done setups very similar to this where I've only done 2 sets of 15 reps on things. Again, just for the first week, just for me to be able to gauge kind of where they're at and to get them through the session, have them feeling good about things. Because you can always add more biceps, triceps, and abs at the end.
Oh, yeah.
Or you can add like a little bit of like some assault bike intervals or something more cardiorespiratory at the end or something of that nature if they end up finishing kind of early, right? And then you can adjust the next session accordingly. So I think also coaches get really stuck in like everything has to be 3 sets sometimes, where
1 to 7, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, like there's a lot of options, you know. So I think even within like that, like don't always go, especially with somebody brand new, like like you might have somebody like 2 sets is about all they can get out of something like this. Yeah. And like Matt said at the very beginning, like if you give somebody who's like trained and understands RPE and goes hard, this workout will absolutely destroy them. And that's also another thing to kind of keep in mind that, you know, it's like, this is like Matt was talking about 20,000 pounds of volume. If I did this workout, it could easily be 50 to 60,000 pounds of volume, you know, within that session, especially like the trap bar one.
Oh yeah. If anybody's done mass by Dr. Pat Davidson, you will know that it's like to accumulate 70,000 pounds of volume in 30 minutes.
Yeah. Like that could absolutely crush somebody who's trained and knows how to work hard, you know? So again, keep that in mind. And that'll be something that we talk about during, you know, the differences between, a client like this versus like a performance client as well, because it again, like somebody's training history, somebody's goal selection, like these things matter very greatly in the amount of volume that you can actually give them. Because somebody can, as soon as your gym pop people are accumulating like 30, 40,000 pounds of volume through this stuff, you can move them on to something else, you know, and it might happen quickly for some people if they've had some like, you know, athletic exposures or something in the past, or I don't know, like, again, gen pop is a very vague ambiguous term that can cover a lot of different abilities and training ages. So
one of the biggest things that I'd like to caveat this whole case study with, and this whole section with, sorry, I had some Sprite in it. I'm just gonna, it's a little gassy. It's a very carbonated drink. But if I'm looking at the way that these people are coming in, and like the consultation with these particular clients, these are not the gym bros that you pick up off of the floor who have something more in mind, right? If I'm looking at a hypertrophy client, I'm probably not giving them this. If I'm looking at somebody who's looking at trying to get a little bit stronger, I'm probably not giving them this. If I'm looking at a weight loss client, I might give them this. But if I'm looking at somebody who comes in with very non-specific goals and they're not tangible, and the biggest thing that they want to do is just start to exercise and be more in the gym, this is probably a program that I would be very confident giving them. Just because they don't have anything like specific that they're training for. If I had somebody who starts adding in any degree of specificity, or let's say we're going through this training block and it ends up being like a Kyle Dobbs kind of person, they're like, this trap bar deadlift is my favorite fucking thing in the world. I want to do this forever. Then it's like, okay, cool. We are probably not going to be doing this program as much anymore. We're probably now going to be pushing that person more towards a specific trap bar deadlift cycle. Right? So this is a great intro block and a great intro period for any general population client who doesn't have any idea what they want out of the gym. They just know they need to do something. And I have had, God, I've been an in-person trainer since 2012. So it's 10 years now. And I have had many, and I've been in multiple markets, right? So I've been in New York, New Jersey, and in Texas now. I have had so many people come in who want something just general and they don't know what they actually are looking for.
Coach Bowsy.
Bowser's defending the family because he doesn't think Kyle's capable of doing so.
Squirrel. There's a squirrel outside. Yeah, no, I think this is something, again, it's like you run this for somebody for like 3 to 5 weeks, and see where they're at, let them progress it. And then based on what you see, based on their feedback, based on, like Matt said, the things they seem to like more, like this will also help somebody with very low, like that doesn't have a necessarily a goal in mind, kind of help develop one, a lot of times. And I think that's an additional value to a program like this is you might end up with some different goals out of it. And then you can program your next block or phase a little more specifically to drive something more measurable, maybe.
I think that's a highly, highly, highly underrated and underappreciated perspective when it comes to coaching, is that every single person and every single coach feels like they need to have all of the answers for every single person on day one. Yeah. We can't. That's not possible.
Which doesn't even make sense from a scientific theory perspective, because training is testing.
Right.
Like you're not going to have you're going to have hypotheses, but you're not going to have answers, so.
Yeah. So it's one of those things where it's like, I think that's that perspective and that ability to kind of detach yourself from the program that you're writing for that specific person and understand that it's going to have to fluctuate, grow, and develop and change over time is going to be a very, very, very important perspective for most people to start adopting. Because if you can, then just like we talk about when we're talking about how, like we talk about movement variability being repetition without repetition, that does the exact same thing for when you're building out programs, right? You have repetition without repetition because you're becoming more skilled at developing a much broader base of programming, right? Thinking of something like this and having your mindset shift to something like that in terms of program design ends up being almost like a GPP phase for program development and program design, right? You're getting such an exposure to such a variety of different things and a variety of different goals when you're putting people through this stuff, because you'll find somebody who goes like, I really like the way that I felt when I was feeling like I was dying every session. Or you'll have other people that'll go, I really like feeling like I was getting really strong on this. Or you'll have other people that'll look at like the lateral raises and be like, the shoulder pump, like my friends were commenting on it and I love that. Right. So now you have 3 clients who've gone through the same program that now have an entirely separate and different block 2. We have one that's looking for more cardiovascular adaptations and more work capacity driven work, one that's more hypertrophy, and one that's more it's more strength based, right? So then you have to design each one of those programs and start tailoring those a little bit more to that specific person. And then they may pivot and shift again as well. But you can start drawing from each of the other things that you've developed to easily to much more easily influence your other programs, because all what we're doing with this, all of this, is just managing and applying stress to a person. Right. And all of these stressors, kind of like we talked about today on this on the call. That's why I'm glad we actually brought this one up. All of this is just applying stress, and we're looking at like all of this is just going to be the same level of stress that we're applying to somebody. We just have to figure out the appropriate way to dose it for the given goal and for the given person. That's all I got.
I just muted myself for the
because Bowser's going nuts.
No, that's all I've got as well. I think that's a good way to kind of close this one up. And don't forget that we've got Lisa Lewis on Friday. So she'll be talking at 1 p.m. Central. And that is going to be an awesome call.
That'll be really good.
Make it. If not, you'll see the recording that'll be posted alongside all the others. But yeah, otherwise that's all I've got. So everybody have a great rest of the day and the rest of the week. Later.
Take care, everybody.